Did you say hello to Donna too?
I think I didn't. So good morning, Donna.
Good morning.
Now I'm going through the magic of technology. I'm going to share what looks like a blank screen, because it is a blank screen. And I'm going to move this to here in case I need it. And I'm going to come back over here because y'all want this narrated how to use Zoom thing happening for you.
Do you narrate when you're doing work meetings too?
No, but other people do. It's not uncommon these days. I'm going to share sound and let me know when you guys can see this. Today we're going to talk about, a little flood.
Kathy, guys would be lost if they didn't talk to themselves.
Say that again, Bill.
Guys would be lost if they didn't talk to themselves.
I was kind of curious. I was going to ask him one Sunday school after we were through recording and all of that stuff, if he does that when he's doing meetings, because I imagine if he does it for us, he does it for them, but it's our special play-by-play.
Well, I was actually a participant on a podcast this week for work, but for emergency management podcast. We had, I was presenting for the company, essentially participating on that podcast. And so I had a meeting with them a couple of weeks ago talking about what the topic would be. And this guy's based in California, so everything was good to go. And I get the link on whatever morning that was. I guess it was, I don't remember, Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning now. The weeks all run together. But what I did not realize at the time that I got the link, we logged into their little online studio thing where they do the recording. I thought it was going to be the recording of the podcast to be released later, only to discover, yes, they do it as a podcast, because I've listened to at least one of their episodes, so I knew what it was about. But they also do a live stream. And so I was not dressed in my work best when I discovered all of a sudden, I mean, it wasn't bad. I was in a polo and stuff like that, but it was like, apparently this is going out as live video too. So sometimes it's important to ask questions like that ahead of time. But all right, I'm gonna roll this forward. Can you guys see what looks like an arc on your screen?
Yeah.
All right, so let me know when you got the sound.
Did Noah's Ark really happen as Genesis describes? Could floodwaters really have covered the entire globe? Was God so angry with humans that he destroyed almost every living creature on Earth? If the flood did happen as Genesis describes, what does that reveal about our lives and purpose on Earth? And could it happen again?
Hi, I'm Marcus Lloyd, and this is Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis. Now, in this series, we have been exploring the first book of the Bible and seeing that there's more information and more truth in it than we could have ever imagined. Now, you can't get very far into the book of Genesis without running into the story of Noah's Ark. For many of us, this was the first Bible story that we read as a child. And that's probably why so many Christians view it as more of a fable than a real-life event. But the scientific evidence suggests that it is a very real event that permanently changed the geology and climate of planet Earth. Now, if you've ever been on a sailboat on a lake like this, you know you need to check the weather, take certain precautions. Any slight change in the wind can produce very drastic and dangerous consequences. I wonder what it was like back in Noah's day, preparing for a flood no one else believed was coming. Now, you know the Bible story.
In Genesis 6, God told Noah to build an ark that would keep his family alive along with 2 of every kind of bird, animal, and creeping thing of the earth. and God gave Noah very specific instructions for its design. The ark was to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, with lower, second, and third decks, and a window and a door in the side. Estimating a cubit at 18 inches, the average distance between a man's elbow and his fingertips, this measures out to be about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Noah built the ark according to God's instructions, and it was sturdy enough to withstand the battering wind and waves of a year-long worldwide flood.
But biblical scholars aren't the only ones who believe that there was a worldwide flood. Stories of a great flood that wipe out everyone but a small group of people can be found in ancient texts and folklore and cultures all over the world. Local geography and cultural aspects may be different, but these legends tell of a similar flood story. Scientists, both secular and creationist, also agree that there was major catastrophic flooding in Earth's past. However, that's where their agreements end. See, scientists have two very different opinions of this account based on two different presuppositions. To better understand these points of view, we need to get our head around these two very large words that are key to our discussion: Uniformitarianism and Catastrophism. These are two different foundational beliefs that explain why two scientists who look at the same evidence can come back with two different conclusions. To explore this mystery, let's take a trip to one of the great natural wonders of the world. So we've come to the Grand Canyon to see ancient evidence of the destructive power of water. But let's look at that word uniformitarianism again. It explains the idea that the processes of erosion and deposition that exist today have always existed and always function the same way and at the same rate everywhere on Earth. An easier way to say this is that the present is a key to the past. This concept underlies the belief that our world is billions of years old. Secular scientists believe that a single layer of geological strata represents a significant amount of time, even millions of years of Earth's activity. These secular scientists acknowledge that the landscape has changed over these millions of years, but maintain that the change has been slow and gradual and happened at a fairly constant rate. Does that sound familiar? That's because if you apply the uniformitarian point of view to biology, you get the theory of evolution. So, what would a uniformitarian have to say about Noah's flood? They'd say it never happened.
Uniformitarianism is the belief or philosophy or doctrine, if you will, that you can explain Earth history without resorting to things that are out of the ordinary, geologically speaking. It's the assumption that today's geological processes operating at the rates and intensities we see today are all you need to explain things like the rocks and the fossils and the strata. It's summed up in the motto that the present is the key to the past.
According to the uniformitarian view, the Grand Canyon was gradually carved by the Colorado River beginning about 17 million years ago. But what if the present isn't the key to the past?
Creation scientists see the world in the opposite way. They see the past as being very different than what we see now, and don't assume that all the processes happened the same way and at the same rate as they do today. That's because between what we see now and what we would have seen then, there's been a world-altering catastrophe that's resulted in the geological formations that you see here. This doctrine of catastrophism says that the geological features of our planet, like the ones in this canyon, are the consequences of a key catastrophic event, a violent, destructive flood and its after effects. Creation scientists say that the forces that shaped this landscape and altered the climate and geology of our planet were all caused in a very short time and by a single catastrophic event. The element that played a key role in this catastrophe is the one that's essential for our survival: water. When we think about a flood, we tend to think about a heavy rain that causes a river to rise above its banks and flood streets and homes. we don't always think about the extremely destructive power of water, like when a dam breaks and a raging torrent of water crashes down. So, we're back in the lab to conduct a little simulation of what happened back in the Grand Canyon. This is a model of Earth's geological strata. Yeah, I know it doesn't compare to the Grand Canyon, but just stay with me here. Now, we add a little water and we get a puddle. No big deal. We add a little bit more water and pressure, then we get some disruption. But if we add more water and more speed to that water, then we start tearing up the Earth, changing things. We are, in fact, creating a catastrophe. So that's the power of water. It makes things wet, but it can also destroy them in its wake.
Could the waters of Noah's flood have been so forceful that canyons were quickly carved out of the earth like the sand in this fish tank? How destructive was it?
The canyon itself was cut just after the flood as a large lake to the east in the Four Corners area, covering much of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, spilled over its western bank and rapidly carved a canyon more than a mile deep through the layered sediments. And this unfolded in a matter of a few days' time.
Based on this and other evidence, creation scientists believe that the Grand Canyon was not the result of gradual erosion, but the result of the catastrophe of Noah's flood.
So we saw how much damage water can do. But the question remains, could floodwaters have really risen high enough to cover all 29,000 plus feet of Mount Everest? Well, secular and creation scientists agree that the floodwaters didn't rise high enough to cover the mountains. The mountains were smaller and more level, and were uplifted by the collision of continental plates to the heights that they are now. Sedimentary layers containing marine creatures were also uplifted to the higher elevations. That's how come we can find fossils of sea creatures atop the mountains of the Himalayas. But how and when did this uplift happen? And for that matter, where did all the sedimentary layers and water come from? Well, it turns out that both of those questions can be answered the same way. We expect that water came from the usual place, the sky. It rained for 40 days, all day long, all night long, pounding, hurricane-like torrential rain. But the picture's different now. You see, in fact, most of the water didn't come from above. It came from someplace else.
The Bible says that the fountains of the great deep were broken up or cleaved apart at the very beginning of the flood. The great deep, the Hebrew is Tehom, refers to the deep ocean. Many of us believe that processes that unfolded on the ocean bottom during the flood were responsible for much of the water that flooded the continents. These processes primarily involved rapid seafloor spreading, replacing cold, old ocean floor with hot ocean floor that occupied more volume. And that increased volume of the ocean floor displaced water that had been in the deep ocean up onto the continents. It caused the world sea level to rise. So we believe that that was a major source, if not the major source of the water that flooded over the continents. So what about the 4,000 feet of horizontally layered sediments that we see behind us? When did they form? Because they contain fossils, the logical implication is they are a product of the flood. So this implies that the flood was a much bigger event involving much more destruction than most people have understood.
Remember how the creation scientists believe that the Earth was very different before the flood? Well, both creation scientists and secular scientists generally agree that the continents were all a part of a large supercontinent, and that at some point, and for some reason, this huge continent broke up into continents that are shaped and located where we find them today.
The evidence is compelling that today's continents in an earlier time in Earth history were joined together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle into a massive supercontinent. We're convinced from the fossil evidence that a supercontinent existed at the beginning of the flood and also briefly during the middle of the flood. What this implies is that there was a tremendous amount of plate motion during the flood itself. For example, North and South America are roughly 3,000 miles away from Europe and Africa. During the flood, at least 3,000 miles of seafloor spreading took place just in the Atlantic part of the world.
Now, was this a slow and gradual process, as the uniformitarian point of view might say? Or was this a result of a catastrophe?
The plate velocities were much higher than they are today. Instead of 1 or 2 inches per year, during the flood, the plate velocities were on the order of 5 or so miles per hour.
And where did all that water go?
As the plate velocities at the end of the flood decreased, the oceans deepened, and the water that had been flooding the continent simply ran back into the ocean basins.
You see now why these two worldviews are so different. One says slow and gradual, and the other says fast and cataclysmic. In many ways, we explore Noah's flood because the cataclysmic flood answers so many questions about why our planet is how it is today. You see, you have to add billions of years and leave a lot of questions unanswered to explain our history without a flood. But when you include a flood into the equation, all of a sudden, many questions are answered and things just fall into place. The flood also explains something that has eluded scientists for centuries. What caused the Ice Age? You see, scientists agree that at least one ice age happened. And as it turns out, a worldwide flood creates the perfect conditions for an ice age, such as a change in the Earth's atmosphere and oceans. Since this is such an important topic, we're going to study the Ice Age in another episode. Now, depending on your point of view, you believe that these processes either happened thousands of years ago or millions of years ago. But there's one modern day catastrophe that will take all of this talk about a worldwide flood from theory to reality.
Mount St. Helens, which is a volcano in Washington state, erupted in May of 1980. Many people remember that eruption because it was very well publicized and covered by the press. And Mount St. Helens is very exciting for creation scientists because it demonstrates that much geological work can be done in a very short amount of time. Not just the initial eruption itself in May of 1980, but there were subsequent eruptions later on and subsequent geological activity that occurred later. For one thing, about 2 years after that initial eruption, there was some mud flows that actually carved out a canyon that is essentially a 1/40th scale model of the Grand Canyon, and it happened in a single day. And people may have heard of the petrified forest at Yellowstone National Park. And the conventional thinking is that those trees are forests that grew there in place. They were covered by ash, volcanic ash. They became petrified. Over time, another forest grew up in place. It was covered in ash. It got petrified, and so on and so forth. And if you look at the number of layers that you have at Yellowstone National Park, you're looking at a time scale of maybe 40,000 years. And obviously that does not fit the Bible's relatively short time scale of about 6,000 years. So the reason Mount St. Helens is so exciting is that as a result of that eruption, you ended up with millions of logs that were floating in Spirit Lake. And if you remember the eruption, you probably remember seeing aerial footage of just millions of logs that were just floating in these log mats on the lake. And what happened is that these logs became waterlogged and they began to rotate upright and they would sink down into the lake. And so you ended up with all these tree stumps that are vertical in the sediment, very similar to what we see at Yellowstone National Park. So we think we now see at Mount St. Helens how that petrified forest was actually formed. So you have basically arguments for an old Earth that Mount St. Helens has really done a lot to topple. So this is a strong exhibit for the fact that lots of geological work can be done in a very short time.
Now we've looked at the bare bones of the Chronicle of Noah as recorded in the book of Genesis. And as we talked about Noah and the mechanics of the flood, what we were actually talking more about is how we look at our world. Uniformitarianism or catastrophism. Local, small, gradual changes or worldwide, all-at-once catastrophe. And we may not all be scientists, but we all have to choose which way we're going to look at this. Now, the Bible actually talks about this issue. A couple thousand years after Noah lived, the Apostle Peter, writing about the return of Jesus, said that the scoffers would say, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Now, doesn't that sound like uniformitarianism? But Peter then explained, for this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water.
The word flooded in the original Greek is katakludzo, from which we derive the English word cataclysm. This verb is used only once in all the New Testament and describes the magnitude of the Genesis flood, a cataclysmic event like no other. The flood was an event so profound, it's been remembered in folklore and religious texts in cultures around the world.
The Bible points out that people willfully forget that the flood ever happened. And that's what people are thinking today, saying that the flood didn't exist. Choosing to be willfully ignorant of the very compelling evidence that Noah's flood was real. So in looking at the Bible and what it has to say about the flood, it says a lot. Dimensions of the ark, geological details and such, but mostly it says that we should take the worldwide flood very seriously, knowing that it really happened. You know what I love about Genesis? That since it's the first book in the Bible, it sets up many themes that will later be played out in the rest of the scriptures. Now, it may not be apparent at first glance, but Noah's story sets up a theme and a pattern of Jesus spiritually rescuing us. Now, the Bible tells us that we're a lot like Noah. I mean, he spent decades building an ark. And every day he came outside and he looked at the sky and he saw the bright sunshine. Now, he could have easily stopped building, just assuming that the sunshine would always continue. But Noah knew that there was a tsunami on its way. Likewise, the Bible tells us that we are separated from God because of the wrongs that we've done. Now, nobody likes to talk about that. But then again, the Bible tells us that nobody wanted to talk about the coming flood either. In both Noah's story and our story, God provides a way of escape and rescue. The plan for Noah was a boat, but the plan for us was Jesus, a dying, rising Savior who paid the cost for all of our wrongdoing. But here's the point for us. Peter tells us that Noah preached the whole time that he was building the ark. He told everyone he knew about the flood that was coming. Anyone could have joined him on the boat, but it was only his family that believed him. You know, it takes courage to go against popular opinion and stand up for your faith like Noah did. The scientific evidence that creation scientists are uncovering indicate that many of the events described in Genesis are more than just a great adventure story. We'll see in other episodes the profound effect that Noah's flood had on the Earth's climate, on geology, and on human civilization.
Much of the evidence for an ancient Earth is based on calculations that assume Earth's processes never change. But we've just seen compelling evidence that sometimes they do change. In the next episode, we'll explore the age of the Earth and investigate evidence that throws the entire timeline of Earth's physical history into doubt. So why does it even matter whether the Earth is billions of years old or just a few thousand?
Keep watching as we unlock these and other mysteries of the book of Genesis.
John's on mute.
Now I can hear you.
Can y'all hear us?
How about now? Can you hear us now? My
Yeah.
bad.
Sorry,
Yes.
I was saying, it's still a relatively recent concept for me, not just hearing about the rain falling from the sky for the 40 days and nights, but for the rising of the waters, from the changing of the supercontinent and things like that. But when they showed the graphic, like I can see how the North America, South America, and Africa kind of fit in together, but they have like India coming from all the way down here up into like where it kind of is. Is there like a mountain
Dog.
ridge or
Dada.
anything else, or a plate tectonic thing? I know the San Andreas fault,
Turn, turn.
or is there like a fault line over there that would separate India away from Asia?
Yes,
There is?
those are different plates.
Because wouldn't the plates explain basically the way the supercontinent broke up into the various parts? How would
Here.
India travel so far?
Here, no, here,
I
here, do
mean,
this one.
again, it's God. God can do whatever.
No, I don't want you to have, you lose them.
But it had India moving like a long way. And I was like, wow. I don't know. How many of y'all had heard about the whole, not just the water falling from the sky, but the whole water rising from the deep and the breaking up of the continents and all of that? Have y'all done any study into that?
I had not heard that, thought that was so interesting because where we live, we're pretty high, and we see a lot of fossils and rocks, and I always wondered how they got here. So that was very interesting to me.
Well, I studied geology in college, and so I'd heard of Gondwana land, but I had not heard of the water rising to cover the one big continent.
I'm sorry, I'm dealing with a message from work.
Yeah, somebody, do y'all remember Don Scarborough? He said, Kathy, you've been in church all of this time and you haven't studied about this concept about basically before the flood, the earth kind of actually being like encased in some kind of I don't remember exactly what
Like
it
a
was called.
water bubble.
Yeah, almost like a water dome kind of a thing to keep the humidity perfect for plants. Because one of the things I've always heard is it had never rained prior to the flood event. So when Noah's building this ark and telling people it's going to rain, if they've never seen rain before, then it would certainly be hard to envision the concept of it's going to rain, it's going to flood, if they had never even really experienced rain before. And then the idea of not just water falling, but water rising. And I mean,
Right.
here in the Houston area, unfortunately, we've certainly experienced that when it rains for a long time, we also deal with the fact that the water can't run off into the Gulf the way it normally does and all of that stuff. So we've experienced, river/bio flooding. And we've never had anything like 40 days of rain, both day and night. But again, for that whole concept of the waters rising up, that's just, I don't know, that's amazing to me.
Yeah. What I thought was so amazing is how forceful it was, and just the bottom of the ocean, the shale and breaking and making the canyons and the breaking apart, and that was very interesting to me. Just never thought of that before.
Well, they sort of led with it at the start of the video, the two broad concepts of uniformitarianism and yeah,
Catastrophism.
yeah. I struggle with being able to pronounce the second word, so I'll let Kathy's pronunciation serve for me. But you know, to me, the fascinating part about that, he sort of he indirectly referenced it, is the nature of what we looked at in the last couple of videos here. The nature of evolution is that things over time don't stay the same, right? And the nature of the uniformitarianism argument is that over time things stay the same. So it's, you know, there's a lack of consistency across those things. I was actually watching something last night on a volcanic eruption that they believe happened sometime in the 1400s because of the impact that it had on Europe, but it probably happened somewhere in the Pacific. And you hear about, you know, just the impact. You can have global impacts is the point from even localized events. This was probably in the area of Vanuatu and the South Pacific, but yet there's a haze and smoke and a dust that circles the world from, and we've seen this before from other volcanic explosions that had an impact. So even localized events can have a global impact. So it's easy to imagine that a more global event certainly can have a global impact.
And I was old enough, but I just wasn't very attuned to like world events and stuff like that. I was old enough to have paid attention to when Mount St. Helens erupted, and I kind of remember it, but like I don't know. I was a teenager, so it wasn't happening in my neighborhood, but I thought it was very interesting that they talk about the fact that that helps kind of explain how things can happen relatively quickly that you would think instead were something like, I've been to the Grand Canyon and you see the layers deposit. You can actually see that. But the fact that that process would take so long to make it like it is now, what was the process that started it in the beginning? I understand a little bit better. I thought that water demonstration also kind of helped a little bit. So anyway, I think it's still a fascinating kind of thing. I should spend more time studying it, but I do see Don brought up a map of like tectonic plate stuff, and I don't know, but I think it's interesting.
I can't see the map.
I'm not showing it. I brought it up.
Oh, okay.
He brought it up for me. Sorry, Diana.
Okay.
Kathy, you mentioned that it hadn't ever rained before Noah's Ark. Where is that in the Bible?
Well, there's no mention of the fact that there was rain prior to,
Right.
no, I mean, Genesis, if you just look at it, and I remember when Don and I were talking about it, and I can't even remember how it started, but Don Scarborough was my Sunday school teacher for a while, and he had said something during the Sunday school, and I stayed after and asked him about it. And I remember that being his thing. He was like, there's no documentation of rain. The flood account is very early in the Bible, but I do think it mentions something in Genesis about the fact that it had never rained before.
Well, it says when he created water, it was separated between the water above and the water below. But then in Genesis 2, it says no shrub had appeared or no plants had appeared because God hadn't sent rain to the earth and there was no one to work the ground. And then it says, but streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. But I mean,
again, that kind of concept of it coming up instead of it coming down, kind of a thing. And then again, that concept that Don kind of explained to me, that the earth was kind of encased in this like vapor thing. I don't know, kind of like just a thing that kind of kept the humidity level where the plants could
Oh, like a
grow
terrarium
after,
or
you know,
something?
after they were introduced, but that rain had never actually happened prior to the flood. I'll see if I can find it, Bill.
Sort of like a terrarium?
Yeah, I guess kind of like a greenhouse kind of effect where, you know, the heat,
Humidity and
yeah,
kept everything moist and damp.
Well, and this is also, we can chase this rabbit a little ways because there's a lot of different thought even among Christian theologians and those in the creationist movement. But one of the concepts that's expressed here, when you look at the exceedingly long lifespans before the flood versus after the flood, is this natural envelope of water vapor. Part of what that did was protect humans from the radiation effects of the sun and the impacts of radiation from space in such a way that helps to account for why lifespans were longer. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that connects together that's a part of that.
I had forgotten that was kind of a part of it because, you know, in Genesis, the listing of all of the people from Adam and Eve and the fact that their lifespans were for so long prior to the flood. And then you immediately start seeing a decrease in the length of time they live after the flood. And so that kind of protection kind of layer, I had forgotten about that, Dawn.
And there's, it's interesting because if you actually overlap those genealogies with the years that are expressed in Genesis, the flood actually happens in the year of, I think it's the year of Methuselah's death, if I remember correctly. If you actually overlap the things that are there, because what's interesting about that is that when you do the overlaps, you see that how many of those in the first genealogy that's given there that descends down from Adam is how many of those overlapped because of the length of life and the things that are there. There's charts somewhere. I've got charts somewhere. I just can't easily find them and pull them up here, but shows that. But I do remember that I think it's the year of Methuselah's death is actually the year that you would reckon as the year when you connect those genealogies together in the flood.
Yeah, that's correct from what I remember.
And again, so, how this applies back to what we do is that, part of it is just fundamentally what you believe about the age of the earth, which is what, a new earth versus an old earth concept, what a lot of this discussion is about. And then the second part is, how fast can change happen? We've all seen how fast change can happen. Mount St Helens example is a good example of that, but there are others as well. I was watching something else this couple of weeks ago. I think it's the Aral Sea, which is actually a large freshwater lake. Just in the last 40 years, how it's gone from like the third largest lake in the world to basically being non-existent. That's happened in a short span of time. In that case, because of how it's being drawn upon by being used by man. But certainly things like that can happen. We're really not going to have enough time to launch and complete another video. So maybe this is a good point to actually go back and pick up on sort of all that we've covered so far. And again, what I'm really looking for here is what is the application? How do we apply this? So how do we apply this? How can we use this knowledge in our everyday interactions with folks?
It offers an alternative explanation of why we find things the way we find them today.
I certainly agree with that, Bill.
Well, it could also, um, I mean, just what the whole purpose of the flood was. It's a
Yeah,
reminder.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Don. If you remember, I immediately went to Genesis 6 because I knew the flood was in Genesis 6, and then remembered suddenly, oh yeah, there's that first part of Genesis 6 that we've talked about before that we often like to skip over because we struggle with it, the whole Nephilim and what that was all about, and the wickedness that was on, that had crept in, and what that was about. And I think you're right. And the other thing I want to mention is that, the idea of the quote unquote flood story, he mentioned this, is not unique to the Bible. It is a widely held existence in cultures all over the world. Native American cultures, the cultures of the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the Epic of Gilgamesh, you probably have heard that reference before, is a flood story. It's slightly different than the Noah flood story, but the concept is still the same. There was a cataclysmic global inundation, and that a small portion of humans were saved. That's a common theme throughout these. That's actually a global thing. That's not just a biblical thing. Obviously, it is a biblical thing, but it's not just a biblical thing.
And are you saying, or was he saying that that's not a unique thing, and because it's a global thing, that gives credence to a global flood?
I think it's support for a global flood. It's extra biblical evidence of what the Bible is describing. If the only place we saw a flood story was in the Bible, and you didn't see anything like that anywhere else, you would say, okay, is this unique to? No, it's everywhere. People that have no knowledge of the Bible in many cultures and their, myths, and as you said, in religious traditions and other things, have this cataclysmic event is something that is recognized, which sounds either exactly like or very similar to Genesis 6, the biblical flood story.
But
So
in
what
their
I think,
account, oh, sorry.
go ahead, Kathy. No, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, in their accounts, it's not Noah and his family that are saved. I don't even know if, like, the other stories explain necessarily how some people are saved from this event. There has to be some explanation, but I don't think it's a limited number, I think, in all of the.
Yeah, well, for example, I'm a little bit familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh in terms of, it's actually somebody by the name of Upasharan who is the Noah figure in that. Gilgamesh is not who comes to the flood. He's actually a king or a ruler. But the concept there is that the flood is a form of divine punishment. The reason is sort of strange. People were too loud. Were just too loud. And so the
That can be true.
Babylonian or what the gods of that area just wanted to shut them up. So that's why they created a flood. But the broad concept remains the same, is that there was this, it was a divinely created event, and that a small remnant was saved. So, not for the same reasons, and not for now, this doesn't say Noah, but the concept exists there. Again, that's an argument for, in addition to the geological argument, the other things that are there that are an argument for an event, a global event or a more localized event, if you look at different location of the continents in play.
Well, I was going to say it's interesting because I have a nephew who a number of years ago was just kind of grappling, I think, with life. He is a homosexual, and he had contacted me, just having conversation, about God and all this. And he would use, I guess I'd say that it's global in different cultures as a way to prove that the Bible just was doing what everybody else did in the way of telling a story about a flood, and so
It's interesting that you bring it up that way, Donna, because what that implies, because the other thing that you will hear so often on like the History Channel or some of these other documentaries, which I think is where a lot of this becomes relevant. There's things that are out there in culture that argue for other points of view on this, is that Moses borrowed the flood story from Mesopotamian myth.
Right.
In other words, that it immediately assumes that the Bible is the borrowed account versus the other way around. Is sort of the issue that I have with that, is that you recognize, okay, there's a connection between these two, but you want to use it as an argument for your point of view versus the other point of view, if that makes any sense.
Right.
Have you shared that timeline?
I'm about to share. I found this timeline, so I'm about to share this now because it's just.
I think it's fascinating.
So if you guys see that? I don't know if it's
Not
big enough
yet.
for me. I can. Oh, it helps if I push the share button, not just select what I want to share, but actually share it. So can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna blow it up at least a little bit. Okay, but I remember seeing this for the first time. This is using James Ussher, who was a bishop in the medieval period. He calculated back actually like to the day in 4004 BC, when the world must have been created, by working the timelines back. So this is based upon that. But as you can see, here's the this is from the genealogy in Genesis. Here's Adam, Seth, Enos coming down. There's Noah. The year of the flood, so to speak, is marked here. Notice it's the end of Methuselah's life when you do the math. And Methuselah, of course, was Enoch's son, who was left early. But this is what always fascinated me, is that Lamech, who is Noah's father, would have overlapped with Adam. You sometimes think Adam's long gone, right?
Right.
No. There's these overlapping generations because of this. But then one of the things that this quickly points out is see how much shorter the lifespans are after the event of the flood. Oh, and to Kathy's, I'll do it back because I had it here. Here is, this may not be the best one, but it's A1.
I thought that first one was pretty good, or that blue one. Yeah.
Let's see if I can get this to be on the screen. I'm just going to share this screen too. Talk about tectonic plates, but there's the this one's not as detailed as some others, but there's the idea that the tectonic plate on which India sits has a boundary that's on land, which conceptually what I remember from the idea is here that the Himalayas are right here. And the reason they are so profoundly uplifted is the collision of this plate subducting underneath the Eurasian plate and forcing up the Himalayas, which are a very tall mountain range.
Well, the other thing that I found when I looked is it's like a canopy. It's called a canopy. The water
Yeah,
vapor.
canopy. That's what I've heard it called. Yeah.
Yeah. The evidence that the atmosphere was different, one that was more warm tropical with an enhanced oxygen level. Organisms could grow larger.
Longer.
The waters, it says it's supported by the phrase in Genesis 1:7 that God on the second day created the waters above the firmament. There was a blanket of invisible water vapor, translucent to the light of the stars, but productive of a marvelous greenhouse kind of effect, maintaining the mild temperatures, preventing air mass circulation and therefore rainfall. it would have had the further effect of filtering out radiation from space/sun, reducing the rate of somatic mutations in living cells, consequently increasing the length of age prior to death. And so again, that kind of helping to maybe explain the timeline phenomena about why people live so much longer prior to the flood than after the flood.
Yeah.
Now I'm gonna show one more thing here just to point this out because I'm familiar with this from other sources. But that's probably good there. So let me share this. This is a more detailed plate map, also showing volcanism, volcanic activity. One of the interesting things that like oil and gas geologists are doing now, I mean, it doesn't take a lot to imagine how this fits with that, right? I mean, you can see the puzzle piece aspect of stuff, how it looks like this part here, you know, the Gulf of Mexico looks like it was the Iberian Peninsula, you know, pulled out, the type of things that there. But one of the things that you do find on both sides, for example, here of South America and Africa, are very similar types of rock strata. And such that if they find petroleum products, you know, petroleum finds that are like here, now what you find geologists doing is looking for where that would match on the other continent with the assumption that they have a connection between the two that's there. And actually we're on a fairly stable plate except for the things along the Pacific coast. But you can also see that why there's more earthquake and volcanic activity, for example, in parts of the Pacific, because of the way that the plates all play and work together.
That whole, have y'all heard the ring of fire kind of concept over the Pacific?
There's right there.
Yeah, ring of fire basically going around the entire Asian, North American, Western, South American, Western kind of concept.
Any other thoughts or questions?
You know, I still always think, you know, humans think logically, and these stories of the flood from other parts of the world. You know, if I had no history at all and I found a seashell in the hill country of Texas, you know, I'm going to start to wonder, how did this get here? You know, so common logic's going to say this area must have one time been underwater for this seashell to get here. And so
that's exactly what I thought, and thinking that's just really incredible how all these shells are way up here in the hill country. And I just couldn't understand it. But seeing this video today has just opened my eyes a lot. It's just very interesting. And I probably should have taken geology and
and you know, at the same time, you know, my short existence on Earth, my logic tells me that if a leaf falls off a tree, it rots. It don't form between layers of dirt and form a fossil. Right. So, you know, to me, that says that something cataclysmic happened, something different than normal.
Right. Is that it would rot before it would have the chance for something to cover it up and have enough pressure, by the way. That's the other thing that's required is pressure.
And then you bring up the stuff we talked about last week with the paleontologists that found, you know, tissues in fossils, you know. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't make sense that just happened over many years of time. It had to be something that was cataclysmic.
Yeah, and that's actually, this leads in well to next week's video, which is around the idea of how old is the Earth. And you know, that now there's been a lot of in the news here in the last month because the James Webb Space Telescope and other things, you know, of you know, looking back in when you look up in the sky, you're actually looking back in time because the amount of time it takes for light to reach from a star. You know, so are we able to look back in time far enough? Well, that also again assumes that the speed of light has been a constant throughout all time, that's a whole other thing to get into that I have read or watched just enough about to know that I don't understand it the way that physicists try to explain it, but that there's even some question about whether those things that we view as being constant because we have a very short-term view of things may not be as constant as we think they are, is the point of that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.